On April the 9th, 1945, a Lutheran pastor and theologian was hanged by the Nazi regime in Germany. His name was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He's a guy on the front of your bulletin. He was 39 years of age. You say, how in the world does a Lutheran pastor and theologian find himself hanged by the Nazis? Well, he was involved in the resistance against Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime. He was a part of the confessing church movement within Lutheranism and German Protestantism, speaking out against the way that the Nazi regime had co-opted much of German Protestantism and Lutheranism. At the time World War II broke out, he was actually lecturing in the United States, but he returned to Germany because he said that it'd be inappropriate for him to go back to Germany after the war to try to rebuild it if he wasn't willing to suffer in Germany resisting the Nazis. Indeed, he did that. He actually joined German intelligence, as strange as that may sound, but worked as effectively as a double agent, trying to undermine the Nazi regime. Ultimately, he was hanged at 39 years of age because he was implicated in a plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler, one of a few. He's remembered today by many Christians as a martyr for the faith. He wrote a book, perhaps more than one book, but one that more than any other is remembered, The Cost of Discipleship. I read it in college. I remember the most poignant line for me was the line from the book, when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. Because Bonhoeffer didn't just say the words, he followed through with the deeds and was killed for it. I want to talk to you today about Jesus' call to his disciples, literally to a crowd of people who were following him. But you can follow Jesus and only be a fan of Jesus without necessarily being someone who is a follower. You know, there's a difference between being a fan and being a follower, right? Jesus is going to address a group of fans and call them to a life of discipleship, which is what really being a follower of Jesus is all about. It's just not following Jesus when it's popular or when it doesn't cause you any trouble, but it's being willing to embrace the potential suffering that goes along with actually following the true principles of Jesus. The context of this story is Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem for the final time. We know the outcome of that story. And he's trying to prepare those who follow him for the negative aspects of what it means to be a part of his entourage. You know, in the end, this crowds of people would only go so far with him. By the time of his death and resurrection, we find in Luke's narrative, found in the book of Acts, the follow-up story, there's only 120 disciples still a part of that community in Jerusalem awaiting the day of Pentecost. So considerable, the crowd was considerably whittled down when the moment of crisis came. Even those closest to him went astray for a time. Jesus' words are his call to discipleship. It's not the first time he said words like this. He'd already told his disciples this very thing. Peter even had an encounter with Jesus where Peter reminded Jesus that they had given up family and friends and houses and lands to follow Jesus. And Jesus told them that they would be rewarded in the resurrection. So Jesus had tried to prepare. He tried to be honest. He was very much committed to truth in advertising. He was not one of these kinds of preachers that we sometimes come across that only give the wonderful parts of the story. He's prepared to tell people that it might not always be so good. As a matter of fact, it would be bad before it became good. So let's look at this story today, and I want you to think about how Christians around the world throughout the history of our faith have truly counted the cost. And not every circumstance demands that we suffer for Jesus. But when called upon, and we have to choose between the principles that Jesus taught and the principles that our culture or our nation or our own families insist upon when they conflict, we're called upon to choose the higher road, which is the path of Christ. So let's look at this story for a few moments and see what's going on here. We're told that crowds of people are following him. And Jesus turns, where the words are, he turns, he stops and he turns and he looks at the crowd and he says something that seems kind of shocking. He tells them you have to hate your father and your mother, your brother and your sister. Hate even your own life. Now that's strong. Those are strong words. We don't normally associate Jesus with telling people you have to hate people, especially the people that are closest to us, much less closest to you being yourself. Hate here is really an example of prophetic hyperbole. He's not calling you to hate simply for the sake of hating. He's saying that when it comes to a time of decision, when you come to a point of crisis where you have to choose between what is right and what everybody in your circle expects you to do, you have to choose what is right. It's exemplified numerous times throughout history. We can think of people who have stood up simply for the right of others to practice freely their beliefs. We think about during civil rights struggle in our own country, where on the first march from Selma, a member of the clergy was killed, a white member of the clergy who was killed in the horrible attacks upon those who were part of that crossing the bridge in Selma. Remember that? People have stood, and there have always been people been willing to stand. But the vast majority of people, unfortunately, have not. Because they have not embodied Jesus' words that sometimes, in making a commitment to what is true and right and good and just, may very well mean turning your back even on those closest to you. So Jesus encounters the crowd and tells them that they have to make a choice. They were fascinated with his words and deeds. You know, they had been a large crowd several times mentioned in the Gospel of Luke. It was a fascinating character. He was teaching a fresh, new vision of what it meant to be a follower, a person of faith in the God of Israel. He had also been proclaiming that the kingdom of God was near, and he had been providing both some free food and some free health care. And the people loved it. They wanted more. Those are things every human being needs. We need to have something to eat, and we need some way to overcome our sicknesses and our injuries and our disabilities. People long for those things. But Jesus says, look, it's going to be tougher than that. It will not always be food and healing. Sometimes it will be crucifixions, where you have to take up and bear your cross. Now, that language in that part of the world was fairly well known because the Romans crucified people. And typically, as a requirement, before they would crucify them, they would often make them bear their cross, or at least the crossbar, to the place of crucifixion. And everybody who saw someone walking around bearing their cross knew that they were on their way to die. They were done for. The system had gotten them. Jesus is saying to those who are thinking about following him, his fans, that listen, being a fan is not enough. If you're going to follow me, you're going to have to put that crossbar on your shoulder and give up even possibly your own life. That's what's at stake. He didn't want to deceive anybody. He wanted anybody to be deluded. That was all going to be this wonderful thing where they would go into Jerusalem and they'd be welcomed with open arms. They would receive kisses and hugs, and a wonderful welcome in the kingdom of God would appear, and everything would be wonderful forever and ever and ever. Jesus says, nope, before there's glory, there will definitely be a cross. And if you're not willing to put that crossbar on your shoulders and bear it, then you cannot be my disciple. Because I'm not looking for fans, I'm looking for followers. So that's what he told them. We're not told their reaction. We know ultimately what happened. Very few did make that commitment. But Jesus warned them. And it's a warning that still rings true for us today. But we have to think deeply about, are we a follower of Jesus, or are we just kind of a fan of Jesus? Jesus didn't stop there. He told two parables. One was a parable of a man who was going to build a tower. And Jesus said this man, if he was wise, would sit down and estimate the cost to make sure that he had enough resources to build the tower. Because it'd be terribly embarrassing to start to build and run out of money. And people would walk by and they would say, look, he started the build. He must have not have realized the situation he was in. So he says a wise man will take the time to estimate the cost of a building before he will start to build it. He also tells another story of a king who goes out to war. He only has 10,000 troops, and he's facing another king who has 20,000 troops. Jesus says that king will be very wise to count the cost, and under those circumstances to send out a delegation to seek terms of peace, to avoid the embarrassment of an utter defeat in a 2-to-1 battle. Both parables are sending that central message, that we need to really understand what it means to follow Jesus, that it's not all fun and games. That it requires making a commitment. And we have seen people throughout history who have done that. But there is a great temptation. There is a great temptation to pull our punches when we are afraid that it might embarrass our family, or to hold back when we think it might cause us disfavor and ostracism in our communities. It's easy just to go with the flow, and many people do. But Jesus was not one of those kind of people. I told you just last week he would go to dinner, and sometimes he was not a very good guest, because Jesus was not afraid to speak the truth to power, whether it be people who were his potential fans or people who were his most adamant foes. Big or small, significant or seemingly insignificant people, Jesus was not afraid to say, you know, that's wrong. It's incompatible with love for neighbor as oneself. It's incompatible with treating others as you wish to be treated. It's unjust. It shows a lack of compassion. And it's arrogant, proud, and it's the exact opposite of humility. Jesus says over and over again, you know, that's wrong. He was a straight shooter. And here's an example of him telling those who wanted to follow me, at least the people who were considering it, the people who, as far as I can tell, may have just wanted the goodies and the good times. Jesus says bad times are coming. So what does this say to us today? Well, let's be honest. While most American Christians worry little about being persecuted for their faith, it is also true that many American Christians do not follow Jesus. Is that true? Many American Christians do not follow Jesus. Do you know what I mean? There's a difference between Christianity and following Jesus. Christianity has become very easy. It's very easy in our culture to say, I'm a Christian. Notice how many people do it. But not right. Dietrich Bonhoeffer talked about costly grace rather than cheap grace. For us, it's easy to love grace. It's easy to just say, hey, I'm a Christian. In American society today, people stand in line to hear a Christian. Well, I'll tell you what, when you start really talking about what Jesus actually said and what he actually did, the gap today between American Christianity and following Jesus is so great, and I'm afraid growing in America today, that it's embarrassing. I'm not sure if Jesus physically returned here in this position today we're in, that he would even recognize what they've done to his name because of the huge gap. That's true of Christian history. There have been far too many examples in Christian history where Christianity has just simply been a thinly veiled religious mask for doing whatever powerful people wanted to do to abuse others. Very thinly veiled mask. where it's been more about power politics or dominant cultures. It's been more about oppression in the name of God than it has been about following Jesus, who never oppressed the poor, the weak, or the marginalized. Rather, he tried to lift them up. So we must ask ourselves, in a world like I did, I grew up in the American South, and there were more, we used to say, there were more Baptists per square inch in the state of Alabama than perhaps anywhere else in the world, except maybe Mississippi. We were a very Christian culture, weren't we, in the South, the American South. We really followed Jesus, didn't we? Far too many examples where we didn't. The legacy of racism and slavery and segregation preached from our pulpits, where virtually every pro-segregation politician was an adamant and outspoken Christian. But they weren't following Jesus. And that's the difference. So today when we think about what this means, what does it mean? Now, I'm not looking to suffer. I'm not particularly excited about being persecuted. I don't want to go to jail. I certainly don't want to be hanged or killed for my faith. But if I'm honest with myself about being a follower of Jesus, I have to ask the question. If I'm ever in a point of crisis where I have to decide between what the crowd says is good, what the culture, what even my own family says, am I willing to make those hard choices? And I'll tell you, you say, oh, I'll do it. No, man, you probably haven't faced the crisis. You know, it's easy to say when we're all among friends and the air is cool and everybody's being nice to one another. Oh, I do that. Really? It's the hard choices. It's Bonhoeffer making the decision to leave America, where he could have stayed while he was on tour, and going back to Germany to resist Nazism and the embedded racism of that culture. It's the dark moments when you're tempted to just give in and go with the flow. Those are the hard ones. It's when you're in a Birmingham jail when it's really challenging, when you have to decide your future. You know, there was a man who was in the Birmingham jail. He was also 39 when he was killed. He had got some of his inspiration from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, by the way. 39 years old, he died 23 years to the month after Dietrich Bonhoeffer was hanged. His name is Martin Luther King, Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. said at one point, it was after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, he said, that's going to happen to me. I'm not going to make it till I'm 40 years old. He did not. Because he used a process called nonviolent resistance, non-cooperation with evil, and he risked every day of his life being shot dead by a culture that despised him. Despised him. Until it finally happened. He was shot on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, April the 4th, 1968, allegedly by James Earl Ray. Martin Luther King Jr. was asked about the potential of his being killed. He says, that day will come, but I hope I'm remembered as someone who died serving others. I mentioned him and I mentioned Dietrich Bonhoeffer to say, indeed, there have been people, when they were in the face of the crisis, they understood the words of Jesus clearly. That there are times when we must say no to family and friends. There are times when we must say no to our culture and say no to our government. There are times when we have to say no to ourselves and be willing to give up everything we have to stand for what is true, what is good, and what is righteous, and what is just. Are we willing to do that? I don't know. But that's what we're called to. But I'll tell you what, those are the kind of people, when they do, those are the kind of people that we remember as powerful examples and that we admire. If you have to say, you may not have known Dietrich Bonhoeffer till today, but if you had to pick two people, who do you admire, Bonhoeffer or Hitler? Or those many people who just went along with Hitler's scheme, even the churches? Who do you remember as a hero? Do you remember a Martin Luther King Jr. or a Bull Connor, police chief of Birmingham? I don't know anybody, well, I wouldn't say that. Let me back up. Few people today admire a Bull Connor or George C. Wallace at his worst. But we remember and we revere those who had the moral courage to stand up for what was right, even when it cost them everything. When Christ calls us, He calls us sometimes to come and die. And that's the real test of whether we're a follower of Jesus or just a fan.